Go for it.
Yes. So Doug Ball is the creator of Scare, or Scare, or maybe Trilled, maybe not, I think, depending on your preference. PhD candidate in linguistics at Stanford, previously from Rochester, also in linguistics. Yeah. And I think he will have a few interesting things to say. So please, go.
So the title of my talk is Conlanging and the Linear Aspects of Syntax, and the more I think about it, yeah, it's on page 11 of your program, for those of you keeping score at home. The more I think about it, maybe the conlanging is sort of just like kind of an implicature, because I'll actually be mostly talking about natural language data, but my goal is really to give you ideas for things to stick in your conlangs, much like John's talk and I think some of the talks that will be following. So the topic of this talk is the linearization framework from the framework known as head-driven phrase structure grammar. And there's actually a lot more to HPSG than I'm presenting here. And if you're curious about it, you can ask me in the question time or some later time. This sort of linearization framework that I'm talking about has also been used in versions of some other theories as well. But I think really the more important thing that I'm going to be talking about is what happens in various natural languages and the generalizations that are sort of out there. And I really believe that we can sort of learn a lot from natural languages because it's not always obvious sort of what to invent, but lots of existing languages have done cool things. You might as well learn a thing or two from them. So the plan is that I'm going to first give some background and motivation to look for linear generalizations, and I will tread into the dreaded Chomsky zone that John was sort of not wanting to go into. And then I'll talk about three types of linear generalizations in natural languages. I'll give a fourth brief section on some comments about the known distribution of these generalizations, and then I'll wrap up. So I first want to talk about some sort of motivations for thinking linearly. And so in sort of a traditional phrase structure approach to syntax, you find evidence to group words into phrases and phrases into larger phrases, and you capture these with recursive rewrite rules such as one. And syntax is well known for having lots of abbreviations, and this paper sort of falls into that trap a little bit, but you can read the rule in one as saying that a clause is comprised of two phrases, a noun phrase on the left and a verb phrase on the right. And if you look a larger number of English sentences, you get the rules in two. So we have our S rule from one, and then we have an expansion of MP, an expansion of VP, so that we can sort of expand out the two parts of the S. And then there's rules for prepositional phrases and adjective phrases, which occur within noun phrases and verb phrases. And then there's even a complementizer phrase, which sort of can embed an S. And I should note a typo on the handout. Parentheses mean it's optional, not option. So if you take the rules in two with some sort of statement of what words belong to what class, such as in 3, where we have a certain number of nouns, a certain number of verbs, a certain number of determiners, etc., you can generate English sentences in the tree form, such as in 4. And note that the tree in 4 encodes two things at the same time. It encodes linear order, that is what comes for what in the string, and you can basically just read that off the bottom of the tree. And it also encodes dominance, which is what is a mother, or what is a mother of a daughter, what's a daughter of a mother, and it does so at the same time. A slightly different view was presented in a paper by Gerald Gazdar and Jeff Pullum, and they observed that the rules in 5 are actually missing 2 generalizations. And they noted that the head, or sort of the central part of the phrasal category, is always at the left edge of the phrase, and that the non-head constituents appear in the same linear order in the rules. So notice, if you look at 5, look at all the rules at the same time. If you have an MP, it's going to follow immediately after the head category, either the V or the P. And then if you have a prepositional phrase, it's going to it's either going to follow the MP or just follow the head. And then finally, if you have a CP, it's going to come at the end, regardless of which rule you choose. So Gazdar and Pullum's proposal was to factor out these 2 parts, which is not an uncontroversial move. And so the 2 parts are what can be an acceptable daughter of a mother, and these are referred to as immediate dominance or ID constraints, and then how the daughters are ordered, and these are considered linear precedence constraints. And they showed that the rules in 5 could be reduced to 2 constraints. One, immediate dominance constraint, as in 6, that a head or a phrase with head H consists of that head plus a number of related YPs, and then 1 linear precedence constraint where the head will precede the noun phrase, which will precede prepositional phrase, which will precede any complementizing phrase. And some added bonuses of this is that the ID constraint seems general enough that probably all languages have something like it, and so we may have a universal here. Perhaps more interestingly, the LP constraints need not exhaustively order everything. So adjective phrases in English can appear either before or after the noun. So you have that proud father and the father proud of his son. And so you just leave the AP unordered, and it sort of could be allowed to appear in either position. And this provides a way to understand languages with freer word order, and to a first approximation, they have very sparse linear precedence constraints. So maybe their constraints are just everything appears before the head, or everything appears after it, and there's no other ordering, at least imposed by the syntax, on it. So with this kind of background in mind, I want to turn to several other linear ordering generalizations that I think are actually more interesting than this first sort of intro. So the first I want to talk about is information status ordering. And just so we're clear about what I mean by information status, I mean it as a property of a particular constituent having to do with its position in the discourse. So new information, old information, the new thing we're now going to talk about, etc. These are also sometimes termed discourse functions. I'm going to be talking about just 2 here, but I encourage you, if you're interested in this sort of thing, to look at some of the references I've provided, because this is real interesting yet kind of complicated area of study. So the 2 that I'm going to be talking about here are topic and focus. Topic I'm going to define as what has been under discussion or discourse old, and this sometimes goes under the name of theme. And focus I'm going to define as new information, often contrastive, and similar ideas are embodied in these terms, comment and read. And the linearization generalization that seems to be found in language after language is the topics precede foci. So I want to exemplify this from Basque. So in Basque, most constructions are verb final. And as you can see in 8, focus constituents, including WH words, must immediately precede the verb. So in 8, you have the WH word nor appears right before the main verb come, and then in the answer, the new information, the John, the answer also comes before that verb come. And then you can get topics preceding such foci. So in 9, you have a topic essentially meaning to me appearing at the left edge, and I assume that the comma there also is some sort of like intonation break, but I don't think the source really specified. And then the focus, John, again, is right before the verb, lost here is explained. And this is quite a common pattern. This is also found in languages like Hungarian and Turkish, and also found in the Australian language Walpurgis. Turning to a sort of typologically different language, you see a similar sort of thing. So in Totsio, which is a Mayan language, it's canonically verb initial in sort of normal transitive clauses. It also has topics, and these topics are marked with a prenominal word, a. And you get the order topic preceding focus in these non-canonical clauses where these information statuses must appear before the verb. And an example of this is in 10. The source I took this from actually provided a little context, so I provided for you too. So once there was an orphan, the orphan suffered greatly. Whatever the master's children ate, they ate first, they drank first, and then it's a ti povere sitbe sovre chakaba. It was the leftovers that the poor girl was given. The poor girl is anaphorically picking out the same thing as the orphan, so it is the sort of discourse old element, and it is appearing first, and then sort of the new information is that it was leftovers that she was given, and then the verb is final. Moving to a second kind of generalization, I want to talk about ordering by weight, and admittedly the literature on this sort of thing has some kind of unclear definitions. So what is considered heavy is either something that contains a large number of words or has a complex structure. In many cases, these two are indistinguishable. Then what I'm going to consider light are single words that are prosodically dependent and have some sort of unusual syntax to them. And then I assume that there's actually a category of things that are neither heavy or light that I'm calling medium, but they don't really figure into this whole business of ordering by weight. And so there's two generalizations about weight. The first is that heavy constituents tend, or in some languages are required to come at the end of sentences. And then the second is that light constituents appear adjacent to heads. So exemplifying this generalization of heavy at the end, we can look no further than the language that I'm speaking right And in English, it is at least far more natural to say, I introduced to Mary some friends that John had brought to the party, than to flip the order around and say, I introduced some friends that John had brought to the party to Mary. It's still possible to parse the second one, but I think it's definitely more preferable to use the first one. Looking at some other languages of different sort of typologies, I turn first to Boomo-Fijian, which has a neutral order with the verb first, followed by the object, then the subject. So in 12a, you have he sees the child, the old person, meaning the old person saw the child. However, when you get a heavy constituent, such as a big long complement clause that means something like that they would come and invade Booma, it must appear at the end of the sentence, and the subject is then before it, but still after the verb. Looking at a third typological language, our example of is Basque, which, as I mentioned earlier, has a neutral order with subject preceding indirect object, preceding verb, such as the example in 13a. But interestingly, in Basque, the heavy thing still goes to the end, and this even sort of violates the overall verb final tendency of the language. So you have John said, and then the dependent clause that Mikel lost the law. Now I do want to point out that there may be a counterexample to this generalization from Japanese. It's possible that in Japanese you might get heavy preceding other, but the phenomenon here does sort of vary in some kind of interesting ways from what you see in English and Boomo-Fijian and Basque, and so it might also be an information status effect. And if you're real curious about what's going on, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. Turning now to this generalization that light appears adjacent to heads, there's an interesting example of this in Dutch. So Dutch is SVO in main clauses, but SOV in subordinate clauses. But interestingly, in subordinate clauses, you can get these stacking of verbs, which I think are light words at the end of the sentences. And this is exemplified in 14. Now note, in 14 there is some kind of weird discontinuous things going on, because you have I see, well, who are you seeing? Hank. Then what is Hank doing? Well, he's helping. Helping who? Her. Do what? Feed. Feed who? The hippos. So it's going back and forth and back and forth. This is quite remarkable, I think, that anyone's able to process these. And similar things happen in Korean and Japanese, though I think Dutch and some other German languages sort of take the cake for most discontinuities. You also get something somewhat similar in French. So in 15 is meant to show that the word or after give is relatively free. You can either have leave, ashikant, or the other way around. Pardon my French. But light words must be right next to the verb, and they're italicized in 16. So you have to say that the race gives thirst to John, not that it gives to John thirst. And you have to say that this book makes pleasure to Marie and not makes to Marie pleasure. So this sort of freedom that you have under normal circumstances goes away with these light words. And some of the mainland Scandinavian languages also exemplify this. So going to my last kind of ordering generalization, I'm going to talk about ordering by the thematic hierarchy ranking. And you might be wondering, well, what is the thematic hierarchy? And this is a ranking of semantic roles, sometimes called thematic roles. You could also think of them as semantic relations, and I actually think that Matt will be talking a little more about this later this afternoon. But many people have proposed that there's some sort of ranking of the arguments of predicate, and one such example is given in 17. And there's actually a fair amount of discussion in the linguistics literature that these notions of thematic role and at least some aspects of the thematic hierarchy are problematic. And what seems to be the case is that there's some sort of prominence relationships between the co-arguments, but maybe thematic hierarchies aren't the right way to understand them. And one of the controversies is the ranking of recipients, and the question sort of is, should they be ranked higher than patients or themes, or below them? And you'll actually see that this data is that I'm about to present is sort of ambivalent about that. But taking the idea that there's maybe something right about the thematic hierarchy, and that there's some sort of prominence relationship between arguments of a verb, when you look, you find that in languages with fixed word order, the linear order of arguments follows the thematic hierarchy in terms of agents preceding in the string patients. And you also find that this same generalization is also found as the more unmarked order in languages with freer word order. And you do get some exceptions when various information status considerations, like I talked about briefly earlier, come into play. So in the Germanic family, there are sort of two kinds of languages, ones that are pretty rigid in their word order and those that are freer. And in the rigid languages, the order that's required is agent precedes recipient precedes patient. So in 18 we see an example from Dutch where the agent is Jan, sein Vater is the recipient, and het boek is the patient. Now you know that you get the same order in Swedish, even though the verb appears in a different position. In Swedish, it's appearing in between the agent and recipient. And note that the Swedish example is essentially a word-for-word translation of the English that Jan gives his father the book. The interesting thing that happens is in freer word order languages, the same order that you find in Dutch and Swedish is also the least pragmatically marked order. So in 20 is an example from German, which is sort of the most commonly discussed freer word order language. And here we see again the same order of Jan, his father, the book. The difference with German is that all the other orders of Jan, his father, and the book are possible, but only 20 is the contextually most unmarked word order. So going to a completely different part of the globe, I want to talk about Thematic, which is an Austronesian language spoken in Taiwan. And it is, like many Austronesian languages, it has a verb form that indicates that a particular MP is what is called the trigger, and I believe there's been a fair amount of discussion of these sort of trigger languages on the Conlanging list. In Thematic, the trigger is marked by the prenominal word ka, and it is required to be clause final regardless of what voice the verb is in. So in 21, you see this, the verb here is something like kamita or something like that. My Sejik is probably worse than my French. And note that this verb is in what's called the agent focus, and the ka phrase, kapawan, is at the end of the clause. Similarly, in 21b, we see that the verb form is now C, patient focus, and it appears that sort of a completely different verb is chosen for the patient focus. But here, again, the trigger kapawan is at the end of the phrase. So, assuming that these ka phrases are some sort of information status and they're sort of restricted to the clause final position, you otherwise say adik follows the thematic hierarchy generalization of agent precedes patient precedes recipient, and note here that patient and recipient are flipped from the Germanic cases that I discussed a moment ago. So we see this in 22a. Here the agent is the trigger, so we just have patient preceding recipient, such as, or the word for house preceding this name pawan. In 22b, we see that the recipient is now the trigger, and I guess pronouns are not required to have this ka before them when they're the trigger, but outside the trigger, you have the order agent precedes patient, agent being this word mu in this case, and then the patient being lukus mu, my clothes. And a similar kind of rigidity is found in another Austronesian language, Malagasy, which I'm sure Matt could tell us all about. So, you might be thinking at this point, well, so there's these linear generalizations, but will they sort of fit into the genius of the kind of Conlang that I'm inventing? How does this fit in with other parts of the system? So the information status ordering, I think it is found in all sorts of languages. It is much more common in languages with richer morphology that either have case or have agreement. And the more analytical languages, to the extent that they have this, seem to need extra words to sort of signal that, hey, this is an information status construction and not the sort of more canonical kind of construction. I want to point out that this Bass style thing where you have just a verb and then pretty free ordering of MPs but governed by this topic versus focus type of ideas is particularly common amongst verb final languages, and I'm not sure if it even occurs in verb initial ones. Heavy and light ordering is not actually been well studied to date. It's sort of still in its infancy, and so as far as it has been studied, I think it is found in languages of all sorts. I think the idea, or this phenomenon of light adjacent to head, might be absent from polysynthetic languages. As you might guess, I think they just prefer to slam everything into one word. But these light words are very common in complex predicate constructions where sort of two or more predicates combine to form one sort of super predicate. And we saw that with the Dutch, where you essentially get this complex predicate of see, help, feed, and with the French, where you have these like partially kind of non-compositional idioms, make pleasure, give thirst. The thematic hierarchy ordering is much more strongly felt in rigid order languages, which tend not to have any other marking or any other options unless they add extra stuff. And however, as I noted above, this is also found as the unmarked order in freer order languages. So to wrap up, all these phenomena here might actually not be best analyzed through linear precedence constraints, and actually in preparing this talk and thinking about this, I begin to have some doubts about some of these things. But I think, nevertheless, that the linear precedent facts remain, even if they are to be counted for in some other way. And I would suggest in creating your syntax, beyond sort of doing this sort of Greenbergian type thing, where you figure out where to put your head and where you put your dependence, you might also want to consider more of the linearization generalizations that I talked about here to add some further twist to your syntax. And finally, like many of the other speakers today, I encourage the use of linguistic theories to inform but not dominate your conlanging. It's not worth your while to invent exactly what the theory predicts, because, like most theories, it's probably wrong. And that careful examination of primary data to see how actual languages work also can really inform your conlang. Thank you.
So, does anyone have questions?
I was reading a recent description of Old English syntax. I can't remember the name of the author, but and her conclusion was that IPs and VPs could be head initial or head final, but pronouns always migrated to the IP-CP boundary. Does that sound like a version of light going to heads, or a different generalization about light constituents to you?
Yeah, I would think that is a kind of light going towards the head, and it's also possible that there's some sort of information status interaction, at least based on what I learned about Old English, predominantly from the historical morphosyntax class I took. It seems like the left periphery of the Old English clause is devoted to a number of information status sort of decisions.
That sounds like a head thing, even though it's moving toward the head. Is it maybe the CP, not the head of a phrase, more directly controlling the pronoun?
Yeah. But I mean, there is perhaps a sense in which it's sort of moving to the moat, or the sort of central head for the clause, however you want to sort of think of it.
Do we have anyone else?
I'll ask a question if no one else has one. And your examples 15 and 16 for French.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm convinced by that, because although I speak French, not completely fluently, but well enough to get along. I'm wondering if, in 16, donner soif and faire plaisir have become at this point idioms, so that explains their non-separability here, as opposed to donner un livre, which obviously has no idiomatic structure at all. You can give a book, you can give a box, you can give anything, but to donner soif, make thirsty, it's a single concept. It's no longer thought of by a French speaker as, giving thirst. It's a single verb form, and non-separability of swath, you know, to the final position?
Well, I don't think that it can explain it completely, because I believe in this Abbaye and Godard paper that I take this example from, they do show that various adverbs can come between, I think some adverbs can come between at least some of these sort of light constructions that they talk about. So I don't think it's quite the case that these form one word, but I think that certainly a kind of plausible, kind of some semantic underpinning to this kind of construction really is that they are in some way more unified than just your standard verb and object.
Does that answer your question?
It addresses it. I'm not sure I'm still convinced, but you know,
If you want to ask a
we need
follow-up
a
question.
native French speaker here.
Well, like an adjective, for instance, that could come to the grand spot. Are you talking about a modifier?
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that does happen that Abbaye and Godard talk about is that if you add enough stuff to the phrase containing swath, I think even like an adjective, it begins to behave more like Conlanging, and maybe this ordering thing in French is actually just more of a tendency that sort of.
The other thing too is
What
that
about Q, you know, telling Q spot, gives
the
more,
spot is important to speak.
yeah, to her versus making someone else that is getting erased. You know, I'm just wondering if we had a native French speaker here, what would be permissible for them? Is there a way to get swath to the end of the sentence? You know, to.
It's hard to say because you really do need a native speaker
Yeah,
because
I don't know French well enough to know if putting Q in there would be able to do this.
it's sort of like you can say the tall blonde woman, but you can't say the blonde tall woman. That sounds stupid, and it gets the same idea across, you know.
Iconicity.
Yeah, exactly.
There are quasi-idiomatic expressions in English that
Yeah.
involve give, where you actually have non-adjacency requirements, so things like that gave me a headache versus that gave a headache to me.
You can't say that.
Doesn't work.
I gave money to him. I gave him. No.
That works, but
Yeah, you
give a headache is a little bit,
It's exactly.
it's sort of
yeah.
drifting a little bit towards an idiom. I don't think it really is an idiom, but it's certainly less compositional than give a book.
Pay heed, I think is something.
Maybe.
You pay your, pay heed to someone, I paid to marry heed. I don't think so. So, yeah, there's, I think there's, I guess what I'm saying is, I question whether there's some other factor.
Well,
Yeah.
it is entirely possible that there's a lot going on. And certainly when I was making this handout, I was thinking that there might well be other things going on. But as I only had 30 minutes, and as not everyone here is a graduate student or older in linguistics, I tried to at least sort of present some interesting facts for you to kind of chew on, and hopefully it's some food for thought. And I certainly don't believe that I have the last word on any of this.
He's already claimed that his theory is wrong, so.
All three are admittedly.
Yeah, but all of which
Can't
makes
touch
it
it.
much more interesting to Conlanging.
Oh, yeah, it does.
Speaking of food for thought,